Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome back to another tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be discussing deleting data from within a Django project. So this is quite a simple, straightforward process in actual fact. Django provides us a delete function which performs an SQL delete query on all rows in the query set. However, like programming in general, there are multiple ways of achieving the same outcome. So I do want to drill a little bit further or deeper into the delete function and discuss a little bit about how you might implement that within your application. By the end of this tutorial, hopefully we would have learned how to use some of the different approaches to delete single database table rows. I always think it's very useful for us to understand SQL in general. Although we're using the ORM manager in Django, I think progressively it helps us to understand the code in a much deeper way by understanding the SQL that's actually being executed. So I'll take you through how to display the SQL code for the executed queries. And then finally, we'll just go through the basics of selecting and deleting multiple rows from a database, and then of course deleting all rows from a given table. There is a link in the video description which will take you to this project code. I'm not going to go through a setup here, I'm just going to get started. Let's take a quick look at this project. So we have the core application here with the settings.py file, and then we have an app here called students, and we just have 2 or 3 tables here, and there's nothing of any significance, but you can see we have 2 tables here, and we're going to be implementing the delete function on this student table. If you do download this project, there is already data inserted in the database here, so there isn't necessarily anything you need to do. Let's just go ahead and run this. Start up the project, go to the admin and log in as admin, and you can see that we have the 2 tables here. In actual fact, there isn't any data here, but there might be if you download it from the video description. Well, there will be. So let's just call this S1. So we'll just load this up with some data. So we have some data. So there are some restraints here. So the age has to be, I think, over 18. T1. There we go. For this tutorial, I am going to be working in the terminal. So I'm just going to open up a new terminal here and go to Python 3, manage Py, and then shell. So here we're working with the student model. So let's just go ahead and from student.models. So the name of the app and then the name of the file, models. And then we're going to import the table student. So here we have a bit of Django terminology. So I said table. Essentially in Django world, we're going to call this a model, student. So that's just the student table if that isn't clear at this point. So if I go into the models here, you can see we have this student model. So let's go ahead now and just grab some data. So the commands I'm using here can be just implemented in the views if you are new to Django. I'm showing you here in the terminal just really for convenience. I don't want to have to build a template and some buttons, etc. So this allows me to work with code without having to implement all of that templating. So we can run a typical Django query. So student, what happened there? Clear that. Student. Student.objects, the object manager, dot, let's go for all. And you can see that we've returned 1 item. And we saw that there was only 1 item in this table, and that's the student S1. That obviously correlates with the data that we've just inserted into the student table. So let's go ahead and delete something from our table. Right, so we're told that in Django we have the delete function. And this essentially performs an SQL delete query on the rows in the query set. But in addition to that, it also returns, or it can return, the number of objects that are deleted and a dictionary with the number of deletions per object type. Now, the process of deleting something from our table typically it's a 2-step process. We need to first identify what we want to delete and then just go ahead and use the delete function. So that draws us into another question. How should we select the data? Because we can do this in one of many ways in Django. So for example, we could say student dot objects dot get. And then, for example, let's just select via the primary key, the ID equals 1, for example. So you'd imagine this first item in our table here would be ID 1. So that would select the item from our table. And then we can just go ahead and then delete. So we can utilize it here. So say delete. And then this is a two-step process. First of all, we select the item from the table, and then we go ahead and delete it. So we could perform the same type of function utilizing a filter. So we could have objects dot and then use a filter. And this time, similar process. So pk equals 1. And then we could also then go ahead and delete it. So the key here is to understand the behavior of both approaches. The first approach is going to select the item from the database and then delete. And the second approach is essentially going to do the same, but there are some clear differences between them. So the get here, the get method, this is going to return the required object. Whereas filter, that's going to return a query set object. So that's important because get is going to essentially look for the item in the database. If the item doesn't exist in the database, we're going to receive an error. However, if we were to run a filter, we return a query set, an empty query set. So therefore, we don't receive an error. And if you think about utilizing get and filter, filter is essentially used typically whenever you're expecting to return multiple items. Whereas get, you are always looking for specifically one item. So we can put this into practice. Now we have this. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste this in. So I don't think the first item is 1, but we'll just double check. We'll say pk 100. So this doesn't exist. So you can see here I'm receiving an error. I probably need a capital there. And there we go. So I've run this query now, and you can see that we have returned the error does not exist. So student matching query does not exist. So let's just perform the same action. Just before we forget, let's perform the same action with the filter. And you can see here that we return 0. So there's no error in this case. So I did previously mention that the SQL delete query does return, and this is what it returns here. You can see the number of objects on the left-hand side that were deleted, and this here will be a dictionary with the number of deletions per object type. So at the moment, we haven't deleted anything, so therefore we return 0 and an empty dictionary. So why is this all important? Well, we need to understand the behavior, or potentially we need to consider the behavior of our application when we delete something from our database. What type of feedback do we expect or do we require if someone does delete something from the database? Are we expecting to inform the user that they have deleted, or potentially do we need to inform the user that there is an error? And of course here, what's going to happen if we were to set up our application with get, we potentially could capture that error if an item in the database doesn't exist. Whereas here, if we use a filter, potentially we wouldn't be able to initially create that type of outcome. But of course, what we have here is the delete function, and it is returning, it is giving us information. So if we were to use the filter approach here, it doesn't mean that we couldn't then perform additional actions to inform the user that it didn't delete anything from the database. Because we have this return here, and we can utilize this then to perform maybe some sort of simplistic if statement and capture. Because if we don't delete something, if there is an error, then potentially it's going to return the 0. And we could potentially utilize that to then create some sort of error control flow, or return to the user that there has been an error or something hasn't been deleted as expected. So let's just quickly delete something here. So this item here, let's just grab, this is a ID 6 here. just to confirm that. So we can go ahead now and let's try and utilize that to delete. So pk equals 6, and there we go. Right, so notice that we've got some information here, and I'm going to show you this in the next tutorial. So we can see from the outcome here, we have now deleted one item on the left-hand side that is indicated, and here we're indicating where that deletion is from. Now, if we do have some foreign key dependencies, we might find that we delete student. Maybe we have that attached to another table via a foreign key. So if anything else was deleted, that will then get indicated here in this dictionary. So let's just finish off by quickly identifying, selecting multiple items or just one approach. So imagine we wanted to select more than one student. So we would go ahead, objects dot, potentially use a filter here. So we can say ID and then in equals, and then we go ahead and just identify. Now I think that I've set up two items, 6 and 7. So let's just double check. So I've just added two more, that's 7. So 7 and 8. So ID 7 and ID 8. So looking for any of the entries in our table where the ID equals 7 and 8. So let's go ahead. So we've got two items here. So we're trying to delete those. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so this time I haven't deleted it. We've just returned the two items just to identify we can select those two items. So now we can just use delete to remove them. And there we go. Right, so now we have two items that are deleted, and you can see that it's identified that we've deleted two items from the student model. Deleting everything from the database, the whole table, student dot objects dot, we can just use all, and then we can utilize delete on this. So that's just going to delete everything from the database. I have gone ahead and just created a new item. There's just one item in the database. That's deleted all the rows in the student table. Eventually, you may want to have a look at the SQL that's actually being performed when you run a query such as this. Now, in Django, we can easily have a look at the SQL that's generated. Now, if you are new to Django and the Django ORM, essentially what's happening here is Django is allowing us to stay within the realms of Python. The Django ORM is essentially translating this into SQL language. Now, the SQL language is a language that a database understands and can perform actions based upon the SQL that's been passed over to the database. So let's take a look to see if we can draw down into the SQL, see what's happening in these queries. So from Django.db, let's go ahead and import connection. I'm not too sure what happened there again. Crazy. Okay. Import connection. Apologies. I'm not too sure why it did that. Just put that there so we can see it. So we import connection. So essentially what we've done now in this session here is we've activated a tool which is then going to capture the SQL that gets generated from the queries that we run, and then we can go ahead and print that out. So let's go ahead and just make sure there's something in our table here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll delete that. So this item here is number 10. So let's grab our code here. So we're going to grab number 10. We're going to grab pk10 and then delete it. So we go ahead and do that. So that's deleted. Now what we can do is we can print the connection.queries, and we can now see the queries that are run. So that's a fairly long query. So down here, we've got our last query that we run. So this was delete from. We can't quite see that on the screen. I'll just bring that up. Nope. So there we go. So we can see it now. So here's our query that we just run. So SQL begin time 0.00, SQL delete from. So the SQL that we just run was delete from student underscore student, where student ID is 10. So what we can do here, as you can see, is have a look at the SQL. Now, that might mean absolutely nothing to you. And really, in this simplistic context, there isn't really much to see here or comment about. But it can be interesting to have a look at the SQL to see what is running. Particularly the time here, which can indicate how long this SQL query took. So let's go ahead. What we can do here is we can import, because this can get quite large. We want to potentially just filter this out, or we want to remove this data so we can start again, and makes it a little bit easier for us to work with. So we can say Django.db. There is a tool that we can import called reset queries. So just go ahead and do that. And that's essentially going to allow us to reset the queries. So just remove all this data that you can see here about the queries. So I run that. I'll just save that so you can see. So that's going to reset all of this data here. So when I go back and I just add a new student, so we got here, so this is ID number 11. So when we go back in and run our query to delete, and then have a look at the queries, you can see that we've just got essentially just one run. Now, what's happened here then? SQL, select student ID, student first name, surname, age, classroom. So essentially all the data has been selected. So our query will just run here on our filter. Essentially this is running this query here. So we're selecting all the data from the student table. And then we're going ahead and we're going to say delete student, where student ID is 11. So there is essentially two. That's something interesting that we can see from here. There is two SQL statements that are being run here. First of all, we need to select from our table to grab the data. And you can see that it's grabbing the data here, and it's just grabbing number 11 as we've requested, because we're using this filter here. So that's returning the query set with just one item in this case. And then we're going ahead and we're running our second query. And what can be interesting here is when we're trying to optimize our queries, this is going to give us a good indication of potentially where we can optimize our queries. And this might be kind of an end game type of activity in your application, but it does give us some good indication. And potentially over time, you'll become more familiar with SQL, and then you can start running custom SQL commands, which potentially are more enhanced and performant over the Django ORM. Some key aspects there to think about when you're deleting items from a database. More specifically, how would you like your application to respond when, for example, an item in the database isn't found before you try to delete it? Hopefully that was useful, or gets you thinking about your application in a little bit deeper, meaningful way. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.